Hello and welcome to the Majlis podcast, Radio for Free Liberties, current affairs talk show focusing on Central Asia. I'm Muhammad Tahir, host of the Majlis and Radio for Free Liberties media manager here in Washington, D.C. The Afghan Taliban continue their assault in northern Afghanistan. Following their massive offensive on districts just across the border from Central Asia in northern Afghanistan, now they are increasingly focused on major cities. The latest battlefield is Saripul, which is close to the Turkmen border. Earlier, Kunduz was on their radar, which borders Tajikistan. Meanwhile, Shirkhan Port, Afghanistan's major border crossing to Tajikistan, remains under the Taliban control. While most of the districts have fallen to the Taliban, the situation in Badakhshan province is reportedly critical. Local sources suggest that Central Asian fighters, particularly the ones from Tajikistan, are playing an active role. Recently, our Tajik service, Radio Azadi, broke a story about the Taliban handing over the security of the Afghan-Tajik border in Badakhshan to those Tajik militants from Tajikistan. Though the Taliban keep assuring Central Asian authorities that they have nothing to fear from Afghanistan under the Taliban, but the ground reality is as such that they also closely interlinked with those fighters. They protect them, they work with them. So, no surprise that military drills are taking place in recent days, frequently across the border in Central Asia. But coming back to those fighters, when we say Central Asian fighters in Afghanistan, who are we talking about? What do we know about them? What role are they playing? What's the nature of their connection with the Taliban? Where they stand in Taliban's latest offensive and what the future holds for them? To discuss all these, I'm joined by Salimjan Ayubov, the director of Radio for the Liberties Tajik service, locally known as Radio Azadi, Dr. Antonio Guistozzi, visiting professor at the King's College London, who researches conflict in security, Milani Saduzey, PhD candidate at National Institute of Oriental Languages and Civilization in Paris, also a visiting scholar at George Washington University's Elite School of International Affairs. Bruce Pannier, the editor of Radio for the Liberties Central Asia blog, Shlok Owazi, is also with us, and Bruce is joining us today from Prague. Thank you, colleagues, for joining us. So I'm so happy that finally this worked out. A great panel. I couldn't think of a more insightful team to explore this very relevant topic given the developing situation on the ground in northern Afghanistan. Yeah, so as we speak, we do not see much happening in practice on the ground in the context of those Central Asian fighters there. Apparently, no cross-border activities are reported, but as I communicated to some of you, the fact that those militants remain there in the Taliban-controlled area continues to pose a security question to the countries across the border. This is the way, at least, it's perceived by the governments there. I clearly see that while the Taliban keeps assuring Central Asians as well as Russians that they have nothing to fear from Afghanistan under the Taliban control, but they are not at ease, as we were just talking about. The military drills are taking place, just across the border. I guess today 5 presidents from all Central Asian countries are in Turkmenistan. And I'm sure that Afghanistan is on their agenda. So there's a lot to talk about. So let's start with the current states of those Central Asian fighters in Afghanistan. The latest news being, Salim John, we got the report from you about the Taliban assigning some of the Tajikistani militants in northern Afghanistan to guard the Tajik border. So that tells us many things, I guess. But one thing is very clear, that those fighters are there, remain active, and have the trust of the Taliban. Salim Jan.
At the beginning, a small piece of information about presence of Tajikistani fighters among the Taliban led us to monitor the whole situation, and not only for now, but many years ago. Bruce can confirm that we all together worked since 1990s, even during the civil war in Tajikistan. And always there was groups. 10 or 15 years ago, there were small groups that decided not to join the Tajik peace agreement in 1997, and very small groups in different areas. Some of them just decided not to continue fighting against Tajik government, but decided to find a place for them on the sun in Afghanistan, some of them in Pakistan. And there was a lot of kids at the time who participated in Pakistani madrasas. I personally visited them in 1993 during the Tajik peace negotiations, and leaders of Tajik refugees and Tajik opposition, United Tajik Opposition, always have been saying that they brought back to the country all of them. However, today we can see that it was not true, and part of those people remained in Pakistan and Afghanistan. And moreover, they succeeded in inviting younger generation from inside of Tajikistan and even from Tajik labor migrants in Russia, joined them as now they became a power. Although the official number that the Tajik authorities confirm, it's about 200. By our estimation, they could be maybe under 1,000. But the fact is that now they are ruling 5 districts of northern Afghanistan in Badakhshan, on a very line of the Tajik-Afghan border. In some places, this border is just a river. In some places, all more. And in some places, it's very easy to cross the border and the river altogether. And we have a lot of information that they are very active in contacting Tajik youth, their Tajik friends on the other side of the border, inviting them to Afghanistan. Muhammad pointed out very interesting moment that how they are close to Taliban, and if the Taliban have a full command on them, the information is demonstrating that probably not. Probably they're operating more or less independently. We know that part of them were relocated from Pakistan in 2018 by Taliban, and they were sent to northern parts of Afghanistan.
Salim John, thank you very much. So the connection between the Taliban and the Tajik militants goes way back, the way you put it, and also it's kind of multi-generational. I think relevant background information you shared with us. So, Antonio, you have been researching this topic for a long, long time, as far as I know. Anything to add in terms of the Tajik fighters' activity there, in addition to what Salim John has said? I was also wondering about, yes, we just call them, like, in general terms, like a Tajik fighters. Who are they, in fact? Where they come from? Who are some of the main figures, and what drives them to be there? Perhaps there are so many questions in just one line. Maybe we can explore them one by one later. But so, anything to add into what just Salim John has said?
Well, the situation in Badakhshan is very complex because you have 3 different Taliban factions, if you like, each one of which has different relations with the Central Asians. There are Tajiks, but also there are Uzbeks, there are Uyghurs. And the Central Asians and the Uyghurs are affiliated with different groups. So it's not just one group. Even the groups are split internally between those who are closer or even integrated into the Islamic State, which has an important base in the district of Jurm, which is actually its headquarters in Afghanistan right now, and been apparently, exploiting the chaos, and the vacuum to expand from this area outward. But there are also others who are affiliated with Al-Qaeda and groups linked to Al-Qaeda. So Al-Qaeda doesn't have a lot of Central Asia in itself, but some groups are funded or supported by Al-Qaeda. So it's complex, and we don't know, who within the Taliban has sent these fighters to these districts, asked them to take control. Of course, the underlying factor is the Taliban, especially in Badakhshan, are stretched very thin in terms of manpower. But Badakhshan, the Taliban have been there for quite a long time, but it was not one of the main areas of activities. They had some districts where they were strong. Badakhshan is big, of course, and now having taken over all of it, even with the support of some other groups like Hizb Islami that has also a presence in some Uzbek areas in particular, they're stretched very thin. So clearly they needed some help to secure some areas, but I don't think the Taliban leadership is particularly pleased to see these fighters from Tajikistan there on the border. I think that probably there is a role to be played by the other 2 factions that are not so closely aligned with the Quetta Shura. So the 3 factions, as I implied, one is completely aligned with the Quetta Shura. It's not the largest. Then you have a faction that technically is under the Quetta Shura, but they don't have good relation with the current leadership. They're closer to the Haqqani network in not only the ideological terms, but also in terms of personal relations, and is led by Malaba Shami, which is a Tajik and is a former member of Taliban front called Jundullah, which is a Tajik front that for a long time was supported by the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, but he left and is now, as far as I know, doesn't have relations with the Iranians anymore. And then the third faction is called the Shura of the North, which used to be much stronger in the past, but recently has kind of got closer again to the Quetta Shura, but maintains a separate, if you like, structure. And they too have closer relations with the Haqqanis on one side, with Al-Qaeda, and also the relation with the Islamic State. So I think the main difference between these three factions is that while the faction closely aligned with the Quetta Shura has no relation with the Islamic State and has even been fighting against them, the other two factions have distant relations, sometimes even quite cozy relations with the Islamic State in general, but especially with the Central Asians that are within the Islamic State or they are allied with the Islamic State. So this is due to the fact that many of the Central Asians, of course, before being with the Islamic State, had been with Al-Qaeda and had been fighting alongside the Taliban together, for many years. So there is this comradeship, if you like, that has survived the creation of the Islamic State and the split within the Central Asian between those pro-Al-Qaeda and those pro-Islamic State. So it's very complicated. There are all these different groups, and the way they interplay is not entirely clear. I think in general, the policy of the current leadership of the Taliban has been to be as inclusive as possible in recent years. So Abatullah has been probably the leader of the Taliban since 2001, was been investing more in terms of keep the Taliban together and even reincorporate into the Taliban dissident groups, despite the fact that he's always had a very poor personal relation with Sirajuddin Haqqani, but it's made of the unification of the Taliban or different factions a priority.
That's very interesting dynamics that you are just talking about, Antonio, in Badakhshan or in general when we talk of Taliban. So when we talk of Taliban, we just say Quetta Shura or maybe Doha office. It looks like dynamics, at least in the Badakhshan, the way that you put it, and certainly it looks like the groups like those Central Asian fighters might not be coordinating with Doha office their day-to-day activities, like at the region that they keep under control, or maybe the plans that they might have. That also brings another aspect into the discussion is like, when Taliban in Doha say, okay, Central Asians, you don't have to fear from territory that are under our control. So they might not be speaking on behalf of those fighters. Is it what we should understand?
Well, the Taliban have been trying to talk to all these jihadis, including the Islamic State, of course. So Al-Qaeda and all the groups more or less rotating around Al-Qaeda already last year, starting from late spring and during the summer, they've been trying to convince them to sign agreements with the Taliban, or new agreements, because they had agreements before. One of them actually came into the public domain. It was the agreement the Taliban proposed to the TTP, the Pakistani TTP. That's specific to the TTP, but the other agreement seems to be along those lines. So basically, you can stay, but you have to, register with the Taliban, all your members, not only the names, but also the location, and you need to be requesting authorization for moving them around. And two, you have to commit to renounce carrying out attacks from Afghanistan against other countries. If you look at the terms of the US-Taliban agreement, it doesn't say that the Taliban have to expel or cut off links with different groups. They need to make sure that only that Afghanistan doesn't become a base of operations for them.
Yeah, very, very interesting. I guess, Bruce, I don't know about you, but I'm learning a lot from what Antonio is saying in terms of these local dynamics. I mean, that tells a lot in terms of what happens on the ground, and also the concern maybe on the other side of the border, like with the military drills. Like on one hand, those authorities in Central Asia talk to Taliban and get the insurances from them. At the same time, they are also keep doing those military drills. I mean, there is something there that we don't have full picture of. So what stands out to you from what we just heard from Antonio?
Well, especially the part about all the different groups out there, I mean, it's, when it's very simply and generally described by, international press, they say, well, the Taliban in the north or something. But it's been understood from years ago, since, not long after 9/11 and when all this started in Afghanistan, that people were showing up and coming to Afghanistan because they wanted to join the Taliban or maybe a specific group that was operating inside Afghanistan. But I, even then I'd seen articles where you had to run this gauntlet, and there was various groups that were out there, and they were looking for recruits too. So, you could pass in from Iran and you were trying to get to some group in the eastern side of Afghanistan, and these people would run into 5 or 6 different groups that would try to say, you don't want to join the people in the east, join us, we're better. The Taliban were one of those groups that was also, doing the same thing. So there's a real competition for more people as they come through. It's kind of strange, but that's why I thought it was significant that the Taliban are taking these border crossing points, because having heard these stories from 10, 15, even, almost 20 years ago now, I understood that, people are worried, like the Central Asians are rightly worried that, somebody will come from across the border from Afghanistan and cross north into Central Asia. But if you're the Taliban, you might also be probably considering that if people decide that they want to join a group in Afghanistan that's fighting the government, maybe the Taliban, maybe somebody else, that the Taliban would rather be the first people to meet them and say, great, we're looking for people and you're who we want, and join us. So it's not just the Taliban. We know these Central Asian groups have been there. We've been, our very first podcast was about, the dispersal of these groups in northern Afghanistan. And we know, for instance, that even the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, right? They had sent people into northeastern Afghanistan in like 2015 when the Pakistani operation started against them after they had bombed the airport in Karachi. But then Usman Ghazi became leader of the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, and he decided he would swear loyalty to ISIS. And that split the group. There was people who didn't want to do that. But so, Usman Ghazi sent some people, including himself, he went to Ghazna, but another group went to Herat, and they were fighting against the Taliban in Herat and got beaten really badly, but they weren't wiped out. And so the remnant of the IMU fighters kind of dispersed all over Central Asia. Some of them are probably in these groups. Their group lost, and so they just kind of left and joined up with somebody else. Maybe some of them were in the Taliban, maybe some of them joined ISIS, And then, of course, we do have all the fighters that were forced out of Iraq and Syria, who says Central Asians, and have ended up in Afghanistan too. They're all there. Yeah, it's a real mixture.
Yeah, it is. Melanie, and I will come to you just in a minute. One more question, though. Earlier, Salim Jan kind of put this number, like, we are talking about this Central Asian fighters, Tajikistani, Uzbekistani, Uyghurs, perhaps some others. People also talk about Chechens being present there. So when we talk about them, how should we picture them? What's the size and scope that they are operating there? Is there any best educated guess, Antonio, that you could put in terms of the number? Earlier, Salim Jan spoke about Tajikistanis being somewhat under 1,000 or something. Maybe Tajikistani authorities want to see them like in hundreds, like 200-300s, that Salim Jan put it. You've been there on the ground researching this topic. Have you had a kind of educated guess as to what number of people are we talking about when we say Central Asian fighters in Afghanistan?
It's been a long time since I went to Badakhshan. Of course, it's not a place where you want to go now.
Right.
But I have contacts, my research have contacts there, and it's, of course, it's always difficult to assess what people tell you. It's close to the Taliban, was a brother in the Taliban, says that the Tajiks from Tajikistan who are with the Ansarullah branch, which is kind of loyal to Al-Qaeda and therefore collaborates with the Taliban, are more than 300. But there are Tajiks from Tajikistan again with the Islamic State, and of course these are not collaborating with the Taliban. They're not those on the border. So that's more difficult to estimate, but as again is a significant number. So 1,000 only from Tajikistan seems high. I think 200 seems low. So I think it's probably more somewhere in between, If these are more than 300 with Al-Qaeda, I think we're talking at least 500-600 in total.
And we are in addition, we are also talking about Uzbekistani fighters, they're right, from old Islamic movement of Uzbekistan and others.
Yes, because the Islamic movement essentially disintegrated into a variety of factions. The IMU as such, that still calls itself IMU, most of their members are not in the northeast or the northwest. And these are completely aligned with the Taliban also because they're there with their families and they're not in a position to go against the Taliban. And this is one of the few groups that actually signed the agreement with the Taliban, which was offered to them because most groups have refused to sign so far. So the Islamic movement signed because they really don't have an option. They can't run away with children, with women, and do some practical. There are some of them in the northeast of basically Badakhshan, and there are some with the Islamic State there, probably a more significant number with the Islamic State. And then you have some Uyghurs. The number is even harder to assess. The Uyghurs, as far as I know, the Taliban deny they have any Uyghurs with them, but there are Uyghurs definitely there with the Islamic State. And there's been some back and forth. Some people have been moving between Islamic State and Al-Qaeda several times, basically defecting from between one and the other. So now it's not clear where they are, which group they are. Like is Ajifur Khan, which was often mentioned as the top Uyghur there,
Right.
It's been moving around.
Yeah.
So legions are not totally clear. But in terms of total numbers, it might be that there are 1,000 Central Asians, including Uyghurs, altogether in Badakhshan. Not only Tajikistanis, but from the different countries.
Yeah. Melanie, you were in Badakhshan, Tajikistan recently, and I know this is a sensitive topic for people even to think about, let alone they talk about. What was your feeling in terms of what is known about this group just across the border in Badakhshan and elsewhere in Afghanistan, like where you were in Tajikistan? What kind of feelings they have about them, what they know about them, what they think about them? Paint this kind of ground reality about that group in the Tajikistani side of the border.
It's very interesting because it doesn't come up in conversations or when you talk to people about the Taliban or about what's going on in Afghanistan. They never talk about those Tajikistani fighters who are in Afghanistan. People mostly say that the Taliban are an Afghan problem. They're not Tajikistani problem or a problem that would come all the way to Tajikistan. What's interesting is that, they really set a boundary between Tajikistan and Afghanistan when it comes down to those fighters. So I think it's just another reality for them, and it's not impacting their everyday lives. What they say the most is that for them, they have a lot of empathy for Afghans who are under the control of the Taliban or any fighters. But I think they picture those groups as just related to the Taliban in general. For them, those fighters are related to the Taliban, and they don't make clear divisions like what Antonio just explained. And also, it's interesting because they're not people, the border communities all along the border, they're not afraid of what's going on in Afghanistan. They tell you we continue living our lives. We see the Taliban, they see them literally because, as Selim John said, the border is a river in Tajikistan. So in some points you can very clearly see Taliban walking or just talking to people, and you see their flags. And so it's an everyday reality for those border communities in some parts of the borderlands. But regardless, they're not afraid because they think the border has the function of stopping them. And they know that the Tajikistani military is there. They know that the Russian military is there. And even themselves, some of them tell you, should the Taliban come, it's interesting. They say the Taliban, they don't say any other word. They say, should the Taliban come to our side, we'll fight back. But so far they haven't come, and they're not planning to come. So we're not afraid. That's pretty much the whole impression that I had when I was there.
That is interesting. Perhaps it is for you, Melanie, or maybe Selim John. You mentioned that those people just across the border in Tajikistani side, they are confident about ability of their security forces to stop in case if Taliban comes across, and they don't think in the first place they will do. But earlier, Selim John also said that there has been some cross-border activity there, like new generations have joined the old generation who are already in Pakistan and then came to Afghanistan. When I ask this question, in fact, I also have in mind is just a couple of months ago, there were some security incident. Some of them were reportedly connected to the people in Afghanistan. And there were also reports, I'm talking about in Tajikistan, there are also reports that some people are caught by the Tajik authorities, Tajik forces, security forces, while trying to escape to Afghanistan. At least this is the report that we heard in the previous months by the Tajikistani side. I mean, there is that going on. Melanie, feel free to jump in and what the thinking among the Tajik authorities are about this. And also, Anthony, this cross-border activities. What I just mentioned is these are reports that came from the Tajik authorities, and we always take that kind of statements with grain and salt. So in terms of the cross-border activities, how much of a reality is there in that from that perspective, or how much of a factor is this?
If I may start, I think it's very, very hard to know the reality because, like you said, it's a sensitive topic. So even if you ask people, a lot of time they actually don't know, and they probably don't care because it's not a priority in their lives. So it's hard to get like a clear answer, and it's very hard to talk about it, because it's security related, and even if you try and talk to Tajikistani soldiers about that, they will never tell you the truth, right? Because probably under clearance or something. But so I suppose it's just a very, very hard information to verify, and you choose to trust the official statement or not.
Anything to add very briefly, maybe Salim John or maybe Antonio?
Well, I just say that I don't know exactly about episodes of crossing, whether they're true or not, but in the past, Islamic State sources were saying that, of course, they do try to infiltrate into Central Asia, and of course, it's not possible to the Uzbek border because it's impossible. And the Tajik border is also very difficult, but they say very small scale that is possible, but it's really like a trickle, that they find it very difficult. And one of the reasons why they're not being able to sustain operations in Central Asia, that it's very hard to get anything there crossing from Afghanistan.
I wanted to add what Melania said. Yes, it's very difficult to verify. And if you remember, there was at least two very well-known incidents. One in 2018 when a group attacked foreign cyclists in Dangara, and second, it was an attack outpost in Uzbek border. The radio also investigated the second incident last year, and we found out that, first of all, there was no connection with Afghanistan at all. And yes, however, on the other side, as Melania said, it's security issues. And there is no need for big group or big events to destabilize a situation. And also we should have in mind that the protest potentially is growing up in Tajikistan after 30 years of Rahman's rule. And a lot of people, about 2 million Tajiks, are every year seasonally visiting Russia for earning money and so on. So overall, they could find some base for that. And also, since we have no official opposition, let's say Islamic opposition, there was Islamic Renaissance Party in the country, and it was a group that united people with the Islamic political desires, and somehow they were under control or under, let's say, somehow they have been playing on a legal field. And since 2015, the party was declared a terrorist and extremist group, and many of the members of the High Council of the Islamic Renaissance Party were arrested, and they're in the prison. Some of them got a lifelong term, and others left the country. They are mostly in Europe. And going back to the question that Antonio pointed out about the numbers, in the meantime, I just take a look at a report of the UN Security Council Analytical Support and Sanctions Monitoring Team. It says overall estimated 85,000 active Taliban fighters in Afghanistan, and about 10,000 of them thought to be foreign militants, and 6,500 of them are Pakistani citizens, and the remaining part is people from Central Asia, Chechnya, maybe China, remnants of Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and so on. So it's a huge number. And when some experts are saying there is maybe about 1,000 Ansarullah or Tajikistani fighters, so we could say that probably yes, probably no, but more or less it's not 200 as others are saying. Maybe
Right,
it's more.
Right. Yeah, the discussion is kind of getting expanded today, and I know it's a very important topic. But before we conclude, I just had a couple of other points to be discussed, especially what the future prospect looks like for these people, for the group, for that specific region. I mean, earlier we discussed about what was that the question of how much they are controlled by the Taliban, and also there is another point: how much of their visions are in line with those of the Taliban. After all, what we know is Taliban's visions are limited with Afghanistan, and I guess those Central Asian fighters have nothing to do with that. And so how all these are going to factor in going forward in Central Asia's view of the Taliban. So let's continue the debate talking about these and many other questions very shortly. First, let me recap the debate today on the Majlis podcast. I'm joined by Salim Jan Ayubov, the director of Radio Free Liberties Tajik service, locally known as Radio Azadi, Dr. Antonio Guestozzi, a visiting professor at King's College, London, Milani Sadouze, PhD candidate at the National Institute of Oriental Languages and Civilization in Paris, Bruce Pannier, the editor of Radio Free Liberties Central Asia blog, Kishlok Awazi. I'm Muhammad Tahir, Radio Free Liberties media manager and host of the Majlis podcast, and we are discussing the Central Asian fighters in Afghanistan. So I know we kind of discussed this, but just for the sake of expanding and getting into some of the other points that I had in mind is, what was that, the recent developments like Taliban, we have seen, maybe Bruce, you could jump in here, and recently we have seen this onslaught by the Taliban in capturing one district and the other. And of course, northern Afghanistan, most of the districts are fallen to them at this stage. So any idea as to, in the reportings that you have seen so far, what role those Central Asian militants have been playing in Taliban's recent offensive?
Well, I mean, the most information we had was really, thanks to organizations like Azadi, Salim Jan's service, that we could actually say these are Tajik citizens that are down there. But even from Afghan media, and this goes on for years, we know that these people, there are citizens of Central Asia who are spread out along the north. Some reports have said that, and it seems natural, that those citizens of Uzbekistan who have found their way into Afghanistan, either they were there coming from Central Asia, or they came from Central Asia, were in Pakistan for a while, or came back. Now, naturally, they're closer to where the Uzbek population is, and those Turkmen who have left, citizens of Turkmenistan, and it's really unclear how many there are, but it probably couldn't be many, have also seemed to join up with groups that are closer to the Turkmen areas, which are south of the Turkmen border. So they seem to be dispersed pretty much according to where their ethnic kin are located. It's weird. It's a problem for both the Central Asian governments and probably ultimately a problem for the Taliban leadership too. Because you were mentioning, what happens to these people in various scenarios that could develop in Afghanistan if the fighting goes on for a long time and continues. And that looks to be pretty likely. Then the Taliban won't want to see them go because they need everybody on their side that they got for the fighting. If the Taliban were able to establish control over the area and really lay claim to it, to the point where even the people that didn't want to see that happen would have to accept that they were, in fact, in command of that. And if they managed to somehow conquer the rest of the country and try to set up a government, would they let them stay? We've already talked about the fact that they're useful chips, because if the Central Asian governments show a hostile policy toward them, they just turn them loose over the border and say, go over there and cause trouble in your own country. And so they pay attention to what's happening at home, and they don't help out our enemies. At the meantime, but if the Taliban won, did they want to leave? Even if they wanted to stay in northern Afghanistan, did the Taliban really want to leave citizens from another country who are part of ethnic minority groups in the north, who are armed and know how to fight too?
Yeah.
What happened 2 years down the road, some Uzbek group says, in Taliban-controlled north says, why are we listening to this? Come on, we're all Uzbeks. So forget about the Taliban. Let's fight against them. Not for the old Afghan government or for the Uzbek government or anybody, but just because it's their turf.
Yeah.
And they say, no, why are we listening to this? These guys don't know anything about us.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and that could happen to Tajiks too. So if the Taliban did have control over the country, would they want them to stay? You know, probably not.
You brought us to a very interesting point there, Bruce. Maybe, Antonio, briefly, if it's possible, just to dwell on that question a little bit more. I mean, it's not expected, I guess you agree with me, it's not expected that the Taliban to take over the country in Afghanistan. But what might be true going forward is they will certainly have more influence in the country. So how do you see the future of those fighters there? I mean, their future connection with the Taliban? Will they keep enjoying their protection? Will Taliban keep them there? How they are going to factor in Taliban's communication with Central Asian authorities? How it's going to change Central Asian authorities' view of the Taliban? How do you see the future for those people in northern Afghanistan?
Well, the Taliban had discussions internally, quite a lot of discussions in the past, because, of course, you know, we have to keep in mind that a lot of Central Asians joined the Islamic State, you know, and fought with the Islamic State against the Taliban. And there were bitter fights, especially involving Central Asia in Zabul, in the south of Afghanistan, where the Taliban also suffered some defeats and lost a lot of people in the fight. So certainly they have had concerns about the Central Asians. I think the current policy that it was a result of the mediation between different, or compromise between different factions within the Taliban, between hardliners and more moderate elements, is that they will not order the Central Asians to leave the country if the Central Asians basically sign agreements, Central Asian, but this also applies to others, you know, to other groups. If they sign an agreement with the Taliban, and the terms of the agreement, as I mentioned before, is you can stay, but you are our host, our guest, and you have to follow our rules, and we want to keep track of you, of your members, you know. So not simply that you stay and do what you want, but you need, you know, we want to know where you reside, where every individual resides. If he moves, we want to know before he moves and where he goes, and, you know, so basically they want to keep a register, you know, of these people. And they have to renounce to their aims of exporting their jihad back home. So that the terms of what they last summer they were negotiating with these people. And they said the Islamic movement has agreed. They're not very happy about that, you know, but they have no choice. And so far, no other Central Asian group has agreed. So including the ones in Badakhshan, you know. So these groups have not agreed.
So what part of the...
I think the bad within the Taliban is, let's say these guys don't sign, because many don't seem to have any intention of signing. And some have said already, like Imam Bukhari Jamaat, which is another one of the main, these are mostly Uzbeks, you know, but actually they're Uzbeks, but they, you know, it's quite big. One of the largest Central Asian groups has said clearly, we're not going to sign this. Others have been more ambiguous, like Ansarullah, Al-Qaeda itself has been, you know, trying to buy time. So if the Taliban consolidate control in these areas, if they determine that they want to keep the agreement with the Americans going, and even if they don't, you know, of course they have good relations with Russia now, the Taliban, and they will want to keep Russian views into account. If all these things, all these conditions are in place, essentially the Taliban argument, the thing that they're putting forward the Russians already, is, you know, we can't go against these guys, you know, unless they really force us to, because the moment we go against them, they join the Islamic State. And then we have a bigger problem on our hands. So it's better for everybody, for us, but also for Russia, also for the Central Asian government.
Yeah, I buy your point, Anthony, there. But what puzzles me then is, like, Taliban knows the sensitivities of Central Asians, Tajikistanis, Russians, and Uzbeks about those people, about those Central Asian fighters there. But despite that, they hands over the responsibility of guarding Tajikistani borders to those Tajik fighters. I mean, it just doesn't make sense to me, in a sense, that they care about what the other side thinking about their actions, Taliban's actions. So maybe Taliban wants to give them a message or some sort. I mean, how you put these two things together, kind of contradictory things together. On one hand, Taliban thinks, okay, don't irritate Central Asians at this moment. On the other hand, they hand over the responsibility of guarding the Tajikistani border to them.
Basically, as I mentioned before, we don't know who sent these people to the border. In Tajikistan, the majority of the Taliban are not mainstream, so to speak, you know. They're all Tajiks, you know, they're largely Tajiks, you know, Tajik from Afghanistan, but they're different factions. The Quetta Shu is weak there in terms of direct influence. There's a big faction, the two other factions both have closer relation with the Afghanis, one closer than the other, but both of them have, and the Afghanis are the top hardliners within the Taliban. And they also have relations, although unofficial relation with Islamic State, So the question is, who told them to go there? Was it the Quetta Shura? Was it approved by the Quetta Shura? Or was it the local, these are the two factions, the Taliban based there, who actually have vested interest in undermining the policies of the Quetta Shura, especially the hardliners, the hardliners, how you define an hardliner today with the Taliban are those who oppose the Taliban agreement, but also had always been opposed in the relation with Russia. Now, the Russians and Americans, we know they're not very friendly with each other, but there's one thing they agree about, which is that Al-Qaeda is no good. Whereas the Iranians also have close relation with the Taliban, have no problem with Al-Qaeda, they have a relation with Al-Qaeda, and I think the Pakistanis too have. The Russians don't, of course, and not only they don't have a relation, but they see that as an enemy. So all these groups that have a relation with Al-Qaeda, including the Haqqanis and some other hardliners within the Taliban, and would like to safeguard that. Clearly, they don't have any interest in playing along with the policies of their leadership. Because the moment you have a Taliban, whether a Taliban regime or a coalition led by the Taliban, or even just Taliban control over part of the country, but consolidated control, then of course, the support that the Russians do give to the Taliban comes at the price. The Russians don't do that because they have ideological sympathy for the Taliban. They do that because they want something in exchange. And that made it clear in the meetings, that they expect collaboration against all these kind of guys. The Taliban have delivered something with regard to the Islamic State, but I think for the point of view of Russia, Al-Qaeda is not better than the Islamic State. It's not like,
right.
They like Al-Qaeda more than the Islamic State.
But also, these days, Taliban keeps saying many things, and especially, in terms of assuring Central Asians or the Russians to just keep them, calm. But we also seen that they have not been loyal to the agreements that they have signed with the U.S., for example. Maybe not on the primary paper that they signed, but in the appendixes, I hear there is a mention that Taliban would not attack major cities. But these days, that's all they are doing. So, how much you really contrast to what even the Quetta Shura says. But again, locally, you say dynamics there are, maybe those Central Asian fighters might not be in total coordination with the Quetta Shura or what the Doha office is saying. It's just a so complicated picture. I don't think we will be able to. The idea was to get to the bottom of what is really cooking up there, but I guess it is way more bigger than that. I think we have to conclude the discussion. But just one point, though. Also, yes, in terms of this political intention, one is the Taliban being limited to Afghanistan and Central Asia have their own cross-border intentions. But in terms of the ideology, are they in the same lines? I don't know. It's just kind of open question to anyone. Are they totally in line with the Taliban's ideology in terms of the religion or the values or the traditions?
Well, see, the problem with the Taliban is that it's not, that you can say the Taliban have a single attitude. Of course, there are not many Salafis left within the Taliban because those who were there mostly defected to the Islamic State. They were mostly in the East. I don't think that the Islamic, the Central Asian are particularly Salafi-oriented. I think they are being pragmatic about whether they choose Al-Qaeda or Islamic State or whatever, Basically, they were attracted by the availability of funding to recruit, expand their ranks and eventually bring jihad to Central Asia. So they went to the Islamic State because they thought there was a lot of money there and they were willing to spend it on Central Asia. Then it didn't materialize and then they started going back. But Al-Qaeda also doesn't really have the resources to support major operations in Central Asia. So, I think they ideologically, I don't think they are, very particularly radical, most of them, especially the Tajiks. They are attracted by whatever works, if they have the feeling that some organization is able to support them, fund them, then they go with it. If they could get the funding somewhere else, and that's what the Uyghurs seem to be thinking now when they say, we are a nation liberation movement because the Americans delisted them, So clearly I think they're thinking, maybe the Americans could help us against China. So maybe we don't need global jihad anymore, because global jihad the relation was instrumental, was like, there's money, nobody else support us, let's go there. So I don't think their inclination in recent years of the Islamic State was so much ideological as pragmatic. And the Uyghurs were constantly shifting between one and the other, not only in Afghanistan, but also in Syria, constantly moving the two.
Yeah.
So I think that kind of relationship.
Yeah, so we need to really end the conversation. Just one point earlier, Bruce and I were talking about we understand their kind of connection with the Taliban is complicated. But what about the ethnic groups there? Ethnic groups of like Tajiks, like Afghan Tajiks, like Afghan Uzbeks. What kind of relationships they have with those local groups there? And also in terms of I don't know what the size and scope of their operation or activities these days of those Central Asian fighters. I mean, whatever it is, how is that financed? Who's financing that? Where the money is coming from? It's a kind of open question again. Salim John, if you have any ideas, throw it. And Bruce, Milani, just jump in.
Unfortunately, I don't know who is the sponsor of these groups. But I need to say that, first of all, I like your point, Muhammad, that putting them at the line of the border is kind of message to Tajikistan. I support this idea because they didn't collect Uzbeks on the Uzbek border and Turkmens on the Turkmen border, because Taliban have kind of normal, let's say, relationship with Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. The delegation were accepted both in Tashkent and Ashgabat, and they're already friends of Russia. And Russian Afghanistan envoy of Afghanistan, Mr. Kabulov, just a few days ago, even gave them credit for the human rights, for a lot of different things. Yes, it's a kind of message, because so far Tajikistan didn't show any sign of change of the position toward Taliban. There was no negotiations with Taliban at all. Probably it's kind of message. But what is about future, it's hard to say, because Russia does like Qaeda, does like the different groups. However, Russia needs those type of groups to use against the Tajik government also, and against Uzbekistan, and against whoever. We have been seeing a lot of examples during the last 30 years how Russians played with those type of groups, and now we can see how good friends of Taliban they are. And last point, but not least, do you see any big difference in ideology of Taliban and Ansarullah or Uyghurs, Turkestan movement, or others? Probably there are some differences, but they are not crucial. The main thing that unite all of them is Toguts. Toguts, governments that they are considering as infidel, and all those governments should be overthrown and should be replaced by the Islamic governance. And also, even putting those groups at the border is a kind of tradition of the Islamic wars, medieval Islamic wars, when what group is occupying any area as a war booty or spoils of war, they rule this group. So there will be no big differences between Taliban's ideology and Ansarullah. And we have seen the video of the founder of Jamaat Ansarullah, Amruddin Tabarov, who said that one day we will return to Tajikistan and we will overthrow Togut government.
Okay. I think we have to conclude discussion. Maybe I will give just last point and to both of you, Melanie and Bruce. What I have in mind is, first of all, Bruce, maybe, is there any point that we have missed today?
The only thing I would put in was, as far as, the connections that some of these groups have to the Taliban leadership that's in Pakistan or wherever they are at conferences, is that, we know that certainly from the Turkmen example, we know that the Taliban are collecting taxes, been requisitioning or just stealing local farm animals and staying in people's houses whenever they want. And they've gotten a big boost lately by raiding military bases and stealing weapons. So, they're operating almost independently up in the north. So the only connection they have is really the flag and supposedly whatever orders they're getting from whoever or something. But like I said, as far as being able to operate, they're almost entirely self-sufficient. And that's something to think about. So while the fighting's going on, that's great. But like I said, you have to wonder, since they're able to take care of themselves, what orders they are obeying and what orders might they not want to obey, because there's really no reason for them to listen to somebody in Pakistan, and what they're saying, except, they're all part of one group and supposedly share some common vision of what it's supposed to look like. But like I said, they're really not dependent on anyone in Pakistan for very much, at least at this moment.
Very interesting. I mean, it's an interesting dynamic to keep our eyes on going forward as Taliban keeps conquering those areas. And let's see what the future shows us going forward in terms of the Taliban's grip and power on those places and how that's going to translate into the activities of those fighters in northern Afghanistan. So with that in mind, Melanie, where your eyes will be, what you will be watching at going forward in terms of which direction things might be headed in the future?
I think this point was raised by the other speakers, and it's very interesting, and I think that's the main question. The main question is, what are the links, what are the relations between those factions that actually are hosting Central Asian fighters and the Taliban, and which Taliban are they listening to, if they are listening to anyone? Because just like Bruce said, some of them are working absolutely independently and collecting taxes and controlling the border crossing points. So the question, I think the most relevant question is, what are the relations between those groups and the Taliban, and which Taliban? Because that's the question to ask before even considering that they'll cross the borders into Central Asia. And the last point I'd like to mention is that the border hasn't played a role in radicalizing Tajikistani citizens, right? When you look at the life trajectories of those Tajikistani citizens who joined those groups, or even ISIS, most of them don't come from border districts. They come from inland Tajikistan, from other districts of Tajikistan. And the scholarly literature and the experts on this topic all say that they are mostly radicalized in Russia. So, unlike the widespread perception of the border with Afghanistan, the reality is that it's not actually radicalizing border communities. And border communities tend to be very much against the Taliban. And I think it's also because they have relationships with Afghans on the other side, and also because the memory of the civil war is still very vivid in their minds. So it's important to mention that the border does not play a role in radicalizing the border community.
Okay, thank you very much, Melanie. I guess with this, unfortunately, we have to conclude the discussion, and of course, we will keep our eyes on as to how things develop going forward in the future with the Taliban, with that region, with the Taliban having grip on that region and the future of those people. So perhaps we will have other opportunities to chat on this. Thank you very much, Melanie Saduzai, PhD candidate at National Institute of Oriental Languages and Civilization in Paris. Salim Jan Ayubov, the Director of Radio Free Liberties Tajik Service, locally known as Radio Azadi. Dr. Antonio Goestodzi, visiting professor at the King's College London, and also Bruce Pannier, the editor of Radio Free Liberties Central Asia blog, Kishlok Awazi. Thank you, colleagues. Thank you very much for joining us today. And this is from me, Muhammad Tahir, Radio Free Liberties media manager and host of the Majlis podcast here in Washington, D.C. Until next week. Bye-bye.